Hello everyone. In this video, we will discuss the causes and the effects of the Great Depression. This first section is going to be called The Coming of the Depression. And the question that I'm going to try to answer in this lecture is, what were the causes of the Great Depression? Students often think that the stock market crash was the only cause of the Great Depression, but in reality there are more causes. For example, there was a real estate bubble that had been growing and finally burst in Florida and California. In this bubble, banks were failing, land had remained undeveloped, mortgages were foreclosed. That means that people lost their homes. There was a highly uneven distribution of income at that time. That means many people were poor while a few were very, very rich. There was a prolonged depression in farm regions. There were auto and household goods sales that were stagnating. That means slowing down and not really growing. And there was a European demand for American goods up to this point, but at this point it began to decline. Finally, stock market speculation in the 1920s had really put at risk the investments of a lot of citizens in the United States. Stocks had continued their downward slide by 1930, and as you see in this table, there are two columns, 1929 and 1932. Let's take a look at the price of a share of U.S. steel. In 1929, the shares were booming at $262, but by 1932, that same share was only worth $22. The price of a share of General Motors was $73 in 1929, but only $8 by 1932. By 1932, the economy had really hit rock bottom in America. The gross national product, that's the accumulation of all goods and services that the United States produced in a year, had fallen by a third. Prices had fallen by 40%. And more than 11 million Americans that were in the labor force, that means 25% of all the people in the labor force, were unemployed. They could not find work. In this section of the video, I'll discuss how the Depression affected the lives of American citizens. This section is called Americans and the Depression. The Depression really transformed the lives of people in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the road to find work. Hungry men and women lined the streets of major cities, and thousands of families were evicted from their homes during the Great Depression. Thousands of families had left their homes as they were evicted, and they made these ramshackle abodes called Hoovervilles. These shanty towns, for example, sprang up everywhere. Everywhere there was free land, parks, empty lots. Local governments did respond to the Depression. Cities, for example, quickly spent the little money that they had in order to aid people who needed it most. Chicago was one of the most affected cities in the country. 50% of their population, of their labor force, was unemployed. The mayor, Anion Cermak, even started calling people individually on the phone and begging them to pay their taxes. A social worker in Chicago reacted to the Great Depression this way. We saw want and despair walking the streets, and our friends, sensible, thrifty families, reduced to poverty. The Depression had some unique consequences on Americans as well. Many Americans had left the cities and moved to farms, to rural areas. Rural families, which were already struggling before this in some cases, reduced their meals per day and let their children go barefoot in some cases. The American suicide rate rose to its highest in history, and the birth rate to its lowest. In this section, I'll discuss how Herbert Hoover's beliefs influenced his reactions to the Great Depression. This section is called No One Has Starved. Many Americans saw Hoover's response as inadequate. Hoover had a wealthy Secretary of the Treasury named Andrew Mellon who discouraged government action. Mellon argued that this downward swing was just a normal part of capitalism, that weaker firms or businesses would disappear, and it would teach Americans some character to go through a situation like this. Businessmen also advised President Hoover and discouraged government action for the unemployed. They argued that some good old belt-tightening would be enough. The federal government had never really dealt with a crisis like this one before. Many politicians still believed that helping the unemployed would do little to no good. They believed it would render civilians dependent on the government. That means that people would always depend on handouts, according to them. President Hoover had some thoughts on what was appropriate intervention. In 1932, he said the following: "The government should not support the people. Federal aid weakens the sturdiness of our national character." Hoover did call for associational action, which means he put his faith in businesses to voluntarily hire and invest in their firms. He called for local charities to assist the needy neighbors of their communities, and he asked business leaders to maintain prices and wages on their own without the government having to dictate what they should do. Hoover tried to restore the public's confidence, but he seemed more and more out of touch as time went by. He kept telling the public that the, quote, tide had turned. By 1932, Fortune magazine even published a long article, an expose, criticizing Hoover and his actions as out of touch. In fact, they superimposed images of the bonus army marchers and people in breadlines with the words, "No one has starved," criticizing President Hoover. Hoover did take one action, but it drew on the era's heightened nativism. To make jobs for American citizens, Hoover's Secretary of Labor, William Doak, proposed a solution: to curtail legal immigration. That means to let less people immigrate into the country, and to deport more undocumented immigrants. His campaign really hit the Southwest's Mexican-American community the hardest. Federal and local governments had coordinated efforts to deport Mexican Americans at this time. They conducted raids, and they used scare tactics. They urged Mexican Americans to voluntarily depart. They transported them in buses, trains, and ships. These forced deportations had one unintended consequence, which is that while 400,000 of these people were recent immigrants to the United States, 200,000 of them were actual citizens. They were the children of Mexican Americans who were deported back to Mexico. This last section is called The Worsening Economic Outlook. And in this section, I'll discuss to what extent did Hoover's actions actually alleviate the symptoms of the Depression. Hoover reluctantly acted but made things worse in some cases. By 1930, President Hoover had signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which raised already high taxes on imports. Overseas suppliers decided then to act in a similar way and raise their taxes too, which led to an overall decrease in worldwide trade. Hoover had admitted in 1932 that voluntary action had failed, and he approved the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is a part of the government that loaned money to failing banks, railroads, and other businesses. And it even loaned money to something called the Federal Home Loan Bank System that helped homeowners avoid foreclosure, to avoid losing their homes. Hoover had even vetoed, but then reluctantly approved, $2 billion in aid to create employment opportunities in what's called public works. That means putting people to work in construction or building bridges, for example. In this last section, I'll discuss some conclusions so that you remember more of the content of this presentation. Remember, there are several factors that caused the Depression. It's not just the stock market crash. There was overspeculation in the stock market in the 1920s, more people buying stocks in risky ways, for example, borrowing money to buy stocks and not being able to pay that money back. Stagnating sales in auto and consumer goods, cars, washing machines, for example. The wealth gap, that means that more and more Americans were really, really poor, while some Americans were really, really rich. A real estate bubble that had burst in Florida and California, causing a lot of instability in the economy. Less demand for American goods overseas, especially in Europe, as European economies were recovering from their wartime economies. They had higher purchasing power, and they were not necessarily interested in purchasing American goods anymore. And finally, there was a rural depression, which was affecting a lot of farmers, especially that had endured natural disasters like the Dust Bowl. So remember also that the Depression had some severe effects. There were a lot of people going hungry. There were a lot of people who were unemployed, 11 million Americans. There was a lot of overall destitution and despair. That means people were losing hope. Remember the statistic I told you about the suicide rate and the birth rate. People aren't happy. They're not necessarily having babies. The relocation of people. Remember, some people left the cities and went back to farms. And then remember the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans in an effort to make jobs for Americans. Also remember in conclusion that Hoover's government inaction did give way eventually to reluctant action. Remember his belief in associational action, the volunteer aspect of the economy, help your neighbor, for example. But he didn't believe in relief for the unemployed. Remember that business owners and business leaders were telling him not to give anything in terms of aid to the unemployed for fear that they would become dependent on the government. Remember also the deportation of Mexican Americans that Hoover contributed to. Remember that he eventually approved the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932. And remember that he also reluctantly approved about $2 billion in funds for unemployment relief by that time. So these are the causes and effects of the Great Depression. I hope you learned something new today.